Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Barb, and it's so much fun to be here and be sitting down, and I can just be relaxing a little bit with all of you. I have just gotten out of a 3-hour workshop on vocabulary that I gave just outside of DC, and I feel so delighted that we live in this kind of a world where I can be working with all of you from the East Coast, and we're just time traveling. I think it's quite cool, and I hope that you will end up feeling that it is quite cool by the end of our time together. So let's take a moment and look at what our time together will be bringing. And just taking a moment to load up our goals for our time together. So the very first thing that we're going to be doing is looking at the relationship between problem solving and problem-based learning and the 21st century skills, as well as multi-level instruction. We'll just take a little time to think about that together. And then from there, we'll really examine more closely the steps of the problem-solving technique, which you see across the bottom of your screen. And then, as a little pièce de résistance, we'll look at ways to implement problem-solving in a multi-level setting so that we can be sure that all the learners are engaged. We tend to think of problem-solving for higher-level learners, learners that have more language, but in fact we really know that our learners come to us with so many problem-solving skills intact that it's really a shame to make them wait until they have intermediate level language to express what the great thinking that they already do. And B, there are ways for learners to express themselves even at a low level of language to indicate the level of critical thinking of which they're capable. And we know very much 100 top businesses in the United States were polled for the 21st century framework of skills, and they all said to a business that problem solving was their top need. So we have all of these students who have these amazing skill sets, and they just don't have the language to demonstrate that, to be able to say how they know to solve these problems. Now, that's not to say that every learner has these skills, just as every native speaker doesn't have them. So what we are also doing is a great double whammy of increasing our learners' critical thinking outcomes by providing problem-solving skill scenarios. And at the end of our time together, you'll see a file share pod, which is basically a little window. And for those of you that have not taken a webinar before, you use that to download things directly to your computer, and you'll get a handout and some additional materials, and we'll also be posting that to the electronic community of practice, which Catherine will talk a little bit more about at the end. So I'm just checking to make sure that's terrific. Okay, so what I think is really good for us to do at this point is, if you don't have a pencil and some paper nearby, I'd ask you to see if you can get that, because there will be a couple of places where I ask you to write things down just for yourself. And you really, at that point, that's application type stuff, so it's not really that you want to have the handout. But I think that if we all work together, and we will have some opportunities for you to work in somewhat of a small group, then I think that will give you some time to process rather than looking at a handout and trying to follow along. So let's move forward. And the first thing I'd like to do actually is take us back to our opening. Let me go back to our opening. And let's just take a look at the problems in that poll. And I don't think everyone voted, because let's see if everybody did. Let's see, we have Amy and Dorothy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 11 people, and we have 13 things that have 13 votes. But could you just make sure, if you didn't have a chance to vote, that you vote on the problems that you faced today and hopefully solved, but just faced. So if anyone didn't have a chance to vote, I want to give you a second. Okay, I see some numbers going up. And if you are the person that voted for other and you're comfortable telling us what that other was, you could type it in the chat pod. Okay, so when we look at this, we can see that we have dealt with a number of different problems just today. Now I'm going to close off this vote. Oh, I see we still have some, the overbooked people are still writing. I think that's pretty funny, actually. Oh, somebody, it's going back and forth. Someone's saying, yes, I'm overbooked. No, I'm not overbooked. Okay, what I'd like to do is I'm going to clear our votes right now. And now I'd like you to vote as, or mark from your students' perspective. How many of these problems do you think your students have faced today? So go ahead and just click on them. Look at the clicks fly. We're hitting them all. No one is hitting none of the above. So hopefully in the process of doing this little tiny exercise, we have validated the very content that we're addressing, which is, as adults, we face problems. Whether we are learning English or we are just living our lives, there are problems, and we would be if we were in a face-to-face setting right now, we would probably be discussing some of these problems. And of course, there are some that you have to keep off the radar in the classroom, or you have to put into a third-person mode, and we'll talk about that. So let's go now to the presentation portion, and we'll have some breakaway time, but we're going to just start out, as I said, talking a little bit about the relationship between problem solving and problem-based learning. But the first thing that I need to know, with the green check mark, please, on the left-hand side, is, do you use the problem-solving technique with your learners? Because, you know, before you do anything, you need to assess prior knowledge. So if you would, just go ahead and on the left side in the attendee pod, give me your status with a green check if you use the problem-solving technique with your learners. And you can use the red X, as Julie did, to indicate that you don't. So I can see that we have two people that have not used it, and perhaps you have in some way that you're maybe doesn't exactly correlate with what we're talking about, but you've done something maybe with asking a question and having the students respond to how they would respond in a particular situation, which is an element of problem solving. And it looks like a lot of you have, and it looks like several of you just don't want to tell me. So I will respect your privacy. And for those of you that are not recalling where the icons are, if you look up at the very top where it says Meeting Layouts Pods Audio, there's a little man with a hand raised at the end of that line of information, and you click on the down-facing arrow, and that's where you would get your information, your status. Okay, so I'm going to clear everybody's status. I think I can do that. Actually, I'm going to ask Barbara to clear everybody's status because I've forgotten how I do that. And we're going to move on. Let's think for a second about the connection between these three concepts. I suspect that you have heard of the problem-solving technique before, and if not, you've heard about it because we're doing it as part of this workshop. You may not have heard of problem-based learning, and you may not have heard of project-based learning, but both of these are quite in the forefront right now of curriculum development. They're active learning techniques. They have a lot of research behind them, especially for adult learners, although they're being used in K-12, as the most authentic type of learning, because students are not working bitty. They're working on a larger concept. So problem-solving technique is a step-by-step process, and it generally refers to a single lesson in a class or a single situation. And in some cases, you may build comprehension for a day or two before you go into the problem solving. The problem solving might be the culmination activity after a unit of study, but it is generally not something that goes on and on and on and on. It generally has a start and end time within a lesson. Problem-based learning is something that is a little bit different. It's actually a curricular approach where the students come to class and they identify a problem in their community, in their lives, that they want to address. And the teacher facilitates that process by having the students first identify what the problem is, then work together to think about possible solutions, then looking at the solutions and seeing what language, what skills would be needed to put that solution into play, and then acting on that solution. And I think you can see it's a very integrated way of learning, and it's of course quite specifically directed towards the context of the learners' lives. And at the moment, I'm so sorry, 56 is such a special year. I seem to have lost the name of the woman who does wonderful work with problem-based learning, and I'm really hoping that Catherine will fill that name in for me in the chat pod, or Barb. But we will get there. But there is a woman, and she's in the bibliography, and of course there's Frerian learning, which is also problem-based learning. Project-based learning incorporates problem-based. So problem-based uses the problem-solving technique. Project-based learning involves students doing a project. It may be student generated, it may be teacher generated. Let's say a job fair. Students want to put on a job fair. And in order to put on that job fair, they're going to have to resolve certain problems. How are they going to invite people, because the school is only open at a certain number of hours, and the people that they want to invite are working during those hours, and so that problems arise. So problem-based learning, it becomes a part of project-based, and problem solving becomes part of it as well. So hopefully you see that there's a link. But what we're talking about today, happily, is problem solving. So we're going with the smaller component. What questions do you have, if any? Do, 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 do. I thought I should sing. Maybe I shouldn't. See, it's later here. Okay, I'm going to take this great choral response. Natasha said none, so therefore you all say none. How's that for great teaching? Actually, I don't see anyone else typing. So how about if you all go to your status bars and you give me an agree if you feel we're ready to move on. We used to have a thumbs up, but we don't have thumbs up anymore. Terrific. Now that's a choral response I can live with. Waiting for Mary and Diana on this. Yes? Okay, excellent. And we don't care about the test participant because she's just a test. All right, so here's my first problem. I am a very interactive face-to-face workshop giver. And I say, oh, well, I want everybody to take a moment and brainstorm all the problems that our learners face. But wait a minute. We're in a webinar. How am I going to make that happen? And the answer is, chat pods. So what you're going to do, and I'm going to need a moment to figure out who's going to go where, but I'm going to show you 4 chat pods, and I'm going to break us up into groups, and within the chat pods, you will take turns brainstorming the answer to the question, what types of problems do our learners face? We saw a few of them, but there are far more than we listed there. So I'd like you to, while I'm getting this ready for you, I'd like you to just be thinking about your answers to this question. And I'm going to move us over to the chat pods. And I'm going to see, let's see how many people we have so that I can, anybody who can count quickly is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, we have 12 people, and so we'll put 4 in each. So from Amy, let me put you in here, Amy to the 2 Dorothys, you guys are in pod 1, where it says number 1. Forget about the second number, okay? And then in pod 2, we are going to have Elizabeth through, oh, well, Mary and Diana, you're actually an additional person, but I think it'll work. You'll only be typing in 1 pod. Okay, and then in pod 3, which will be down here, in pod 3 we'll have, I went to Mary and Diana, I have to, Melissa through Pat. Oh, my math is just stellar, isn't it? It's pretty funny. Okay, so we're going to do away with pod 4. We shall hide pod 4. So we have 4 people in each pod, and Mary Diana being actually, we're counting you as one person. So your task is to type into the pod ideas about the problems that your learners face. And I'm going to go ahead and put the chat pod back up so that if you have any questions, you can ask me. Okay, I'll make you smaller, don't worry. Okay, so don't chat in the chat pod where it says the place to chat. Chat in number 1, number 2, or number 3. Good. Julie's got it. And I suppose I should have made sure that I said who is going to be in 2. So who's in 2 is Elizabeth, Julie, Lolita, and Mary Diana. And then who's in 3 is Melissa, Natasha, Pamela, and Pat. And number 1 is, of course, Amy, looks like Anwu, and the 2 Dorothys. And this would be a wonderful time for music. So we're going to imagine music. And I'm going to give you a minute more for this. That's a really big problem, isn't it, Melissa? Okay. So we just had a short brainstorm. Now what I'd like you to do is take a look in the pod that you weren't typing in. So if you were in number 1, take a look at number 2 and number 3 and see any commonalities. And the same thing, of course, for number 2. Look at number 1 and 3. And number 3, please look at number 1 and 2. And just scroll, you can use the scroll bar on the right-hand side of the pod to see the information. And in the meantime, I will make some notes about things that are commonalities. Okay, it looks like we came up with a lot of good ones, but in terms of the 3 groups, it looks like education, legal status, and transportation came up more than once. So that's something for us to be aware of. Let's go back to the PowerPoint, and hopefully it will have saved state. In other words, it will have saved where it was. No, it did not, so we're just going to go back here. So I thought ahead of time and put down some things, and you can see that we have similar types of things. So what I wrote down were, pretty much correlates to the types of things that you wrote down. And that's because as professionals and people who deal in learner-centered, needs-based teaching, we would know the kinds of problems our learners have. And so it becomes very important when you're developing problem-solving activities and scenarios to be aware of what's going to have the most meaning for our learners. And if you're doing a life skills-based curriculum and you're doing health, or you're doing housing, or you're doing family literacy and you've got parenting, or you're doing a transitions course and the students have concerns about moving into the workplace or academics. These are the types of things that we then want to provide as themes for our problem scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but one of the things to be aware of is that if you're going to do a theme that your learners have a connection to, you'll initially want to make sure that it's very third person. Unless a student comes to you and says, I want the class to solve my problem, you want to be very sure that you're not taking, and I realize, this might be so obvious to all of us, but especially for someone who's new, it's not always obvious. It seems like a great idea. It's learner-centered. We don't want to put that student's problem in the spotlight without making sure first that that's absolutely kosher. And in most cases, it's probably better not to start there. It's probably better to start from a third-party perspective, because that gives the students more language to talk about the authentic issue if that's something that they want to bring up. So it lays a little more groundwork. So pretty much I've kind of answered this question. Why? Because of the authenticity, because it is relevant to our learners. But can you think of any other reasons why it might be really good to be using the problem-solving technique in our multi-level ESL classes? And if you've got that paper and pencil, you might want to just jot down a few things. But in order to make our timeline, I'm going to reveal some now. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, it is authentic and it's meaningful language use. So learners are talking about things that have meaning in their lives. They're using language that is language they will use outside the classroom. In addition, there is a language outcome here. You are developing key language skills. Problem scenarios are read, they're listened to, they're written about. Students discuss them. So you've got all 4 skills integrated. In addition, you're using potentially new vocabulary, or you're using vocabulary that you targeted earlier in a different lesson, and now you're applying it in a meaningful way. You're supporting the skills of pronunciation. Learners have to be comprehensible if they are proposing a solution to a problem, and they're going to, for example, tell someone why a situation is not okay. They have to be comprehensible in their expressing that solution. So pronunciation comes in, vocabulary comes in, and of course grammar comes in, because the accuracy with which they speak makes a big difference in terms of the effectiveness of expressing the solution. And certainly if you're writing a letter to someone or an email or a text, the accuracy is also a critical element. And then last but certainly not least in this group of skills is the critical thinking skills. You are accessing learners' higher level thinking. So there's knowledge, there's comprehension. Those are the first 2 levels. That of course comes into it. But you leap almost immediately to analysis, you leap to evaluation, and you leap to synthesis. And those 3 are the places we want our learners to be when they're using language, because that will mean that the language sticks. If you're only at knowledge and comprehension, you're not really moving into retention or recognition out of the original context of the information. And then, of course, through the process of problem solving, the learners are building their interpersonal skills. They're learning to agree and disagree in the language of that. They're learning to manage the conversation and to manage their time. They're learning how to clarify, how to actively listen. All of that is going on in the problem-solving technique. And you focus on different skills depending on how the problem is actually delivered. But once you start working on the solutions and applying those solutions and dealing with the consequences of those solutions, you're working a lot with the group work and interpersonal skills. And I'm just guessing that all of you are familiar with the concept of multi-level using a lot of group work. So problem solving fits into the synchronous group setup for multi-level classes. And you can have 3 different levels working on the same basic problem, but with a different language level and potentially a different delivery system. So your low levels might be working on the problem through having heard about it and looking at a picture. Your highest level might not have an illustration, but they would be looking at the text, and it might be very complex text. And your mid-level, of course, could have some visual support, and some text. So I hope you can see that it's possible within the groups to do likability problem solving with the same problem. So you're not knocking yourself out. You can still do presentation to the whole group. We'll talk a little more about that later. I happen to love this quote, and I think it really applies to problem solving. And for me, what resonates for me about this quote is that our students have a tendency with language to think convergently, meaning that there is one right answer. And we know that critical thinking is a divergent form of thinking. And we really want learners not so much to fill in the blank with language, but to be aware that there are many possibilities for answers. Now, with the grammar, yeah, maybe we want them to fill in the blank. With an exact definition of a vocabulary item, yes, maybe fill in the blank. But in terms of communication, communication has many possibilities. And so by problem solving and developing a variety of solutions and looking at consequences and applying those solutions, students really do start moving into much more divergent thinking. Well, Dorothy, I'm glad I could continue that for you. So let's talk about the steps in the lesson. And again, all this is in the handout, so if if it helps you to write things down, feel free to do it. But none of this is really rocket science, but there is a process, and it does help to follow the process because it scaffolds. So initially, the most important thing is not to say, oh, great, I went to this webinar on problem solving, and we're going to do this problem because I think it's cool, or because I think the students will think it's cool. We want to be looking at the situation that relates back to our lesson objectives and our learners' needs. And then from there, we're going to make a point of determining what kind of problem scenario we want. In some cases, you may just want to go to, you have a core text, and that core text has a problem in it. It's a closing activity for your unit, and that's what you want to do because it's there and it's clearly been built. They've built all the vocabulary, and it makes perfect sense to do it that way. Or you may want to look in newspapers or magazines or online for my problem types of scenarios that are out there and adapt it for your learner's language level. Or you may just want to write your own. And those choices come up for every problem-solving scenario. I'm going to be sharing with you today a couple that are picture-based. In your handout, you have, I think, 20 or so problem-solving scenarios that you can choose from different sources, as well as a bibliography. And there are a couple of books out there specifically for ESL that have problem-solving scenarios that are really at a good level. Oh, let me ask a question, which I should have done relatively early on. Could you give me applause, not for me personally, but just because it's a little different than the green check. Could you give me applause for yourself if you were able to watch the video or read about problem solving with the links that came with your invitation to this webinar? Oh, great. Because it will help because we're going to actually look at that problem scenario. So that's great to have a little prior knowledge. Don't worry if you didn't. All of that is available in the handout, but it does help to know what you know ahead of time. So now I've decided on my scenario, and there are a few things I have to do again in preparation. I have to look at that scenario and I have to identify the key vocabulary and concepts in it, because I have to know what I need to pre-teach. And then I have to determine how I'm going to present the problem. Again, not a rocket science thing. Am I going to have the students read it? Am I going to read it aloud and the students follow along? Am I going to tell the story to them or tell the problem to them without it being a script? Am I going to use a script? Am I going to have the students look at a picture sequence? Am I going to have the students look at an illustrated story? So there are a few different ways for me to present the problem to the students. And of course, eventually the students can also present the problem to the class. But these are the things I need to think about ahead of time. And of course, each presentation has a certain aspect to it that affects the identification of the vocabulary and the concepts. And then, last and certainly not least, I have to plan the application stage of the lesson. And that is the stage where the students take the solutions that they generated and they apply them to the problem. And they do that in a number of different ways. And I'll show you that. But this is the essential setup. This is what I have to do as the teacher. So shall we give it a try? Why don't you answer me if you're ready to give it a try? So I'm hoping that a hand up, Natasha, means yes. That sounds good. Okay. If you have a hand up because you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat pod. But I think you're just giving me that hand up that means go for it. All right. Let's go for it. So we're going to be talking about a problem at work. And before I present the problem to you, I want to make sure that you understand some very basic vocabulary that we're going to be using, because without this vocabulary, you really won't understand the problem. So the very first thing I want to do is check with you whether you understand who the boss is and who the worker is. Now, I'm going to ask you, because we're not face-to-face, I'm going to ask you to type in the chat pod, and I'm going to call on you. So I hope that's okay. If it's not okay, just don't answer. But I'm going to ask Pat, how do you know that the man who's facing us is the boss? And then I'm going to ask Anawu, how do you know that the man in the yellow shirt is the worker? And everybody else, you can be thinking the exact same thing. Okay, and Pat says he's wearing a tie and he's giving an order. And that is exactly the type of information I'd elicit from the students. I want them to be able to understand there's a hierarchical situation in this problem, and so I want them to be able to recognize that. Oh, thank you, Anna. Okay, and he's the worker because he agreed. Okay, and there are other things that we could, if we looked at the whole picture, we might have some other aspects there that would help us identify that. And then I could ask, and I will ask you, although you needn't all answer, but I could ask, could he say no to his boss? I could say, what other kinds of things could he say to his boss? And Barb, could you help me clear status? Because I forget how to do it. And I don't want to take up the time to do. So those types of questions are very important for my setting up the understanding. Now let's take a look at the next piece that I have to make sure that the students understand. So I'm going to talk to you about these two people, the worker and this woman. And I need you to tell me that you understand who she is to him. So if I ask you, and I'm going to ask now, let's see, who shall I ask? I'm going to ask Dorothy Carey. Okay, so Dorothy Carey, is she his co-worker or his employee? And Anna, you're right. He could have said no, but suggesting another solution for later is possible. And Pamela's also right. Sorry, I missed those two responses. Okay, you're correct. You're very correct, Dorothy. She is his co-worker. And now, Julie, why don't you tell me how you know they are co-workers? So you can see, while they're writing this in, you can see that this part of the problem solving is very critical because you're building the vocabulary and the concepts, the hierarchy of the workplace, the fact that the boss asks the worker to do things, the fact that there are coworkers, all this is coming in. Right, Julie? Great. So then I have this other issue, which is that I know that these words are key words in the problem, and I'm not sure that the learners will necessarily, they might know tools, but I'm not sure that they know the word utility knife. And so I'm going to use visuals to help them. And I happen, as the Oxford Picture Dictionary author, I happen to have these pictures, but you could use any pictures. So this is an opportunity for me to talk to the students about the tools and say, you know, where do you see these things and what jobs, and do you have tools? Do you use them? And then I want to make sure that they understand what a utility knife is and how do you use this utility knife. And then this part is rather important. So I want them to understand the concept of borrow and lend. And we know that remembering these words is difficult for our learners. But the concepts, and we have to really verify that the person in the white shirt, is he borrowing the money or giving the money? Is he borrowing or is he loaning? And so then we would, you know, the students could answer, and that's the reason I'm saying it to you this simplistically is I'm showing how at the lowest possible level of language the learners can still respond, because I'm using colors, I'm using simple yes/no questions, and I'm using or questions. I can obviously ask my higher level learners a question like, is it a good idea to borrow money? What do you have to do when you borrow money? But in this case, I also want to make sure that the concept of steal is also important, because that comes up in the problem. So I put this picture up and I ask the students what is he doing, and then I ask if there's a difference between these two pictures. And obviously one is money and one is a television, but just to bring that up. So there's a lot of language happening before I even introduce the problem. And then I have to relate the learner to I have to relate the problem to the learner's lives. So in this case, I'm going to ask questions like, what kinds of tools do you use? And do you share your tools with your coworkers? Why or why not? Do you share your tools with your family members? You know, I have one area where my computer is. My husband has another area where his computer is. His area has a door and a doorway. So he's very irked if he sees me in his room. And we have to talk about that because he's in my room a lot. But I'm not bitter. So these are things that you know that you want to generate, not the bitterness, but you want to generate the information about this problem and have the students relate to it without it actually being their problem. And then let me ask everybody, could you let me know, do you take breaks at work? And if the answer is yes, there's a second question here. Do people ever ask you to work on your break? Go ahead and type your answer in the chat pod or answer on the status. Well, we're about to read a problem or talk about a problem where this guy Manny gets asked to work on his break, and as we know, no good deed goes unpunished. So now it's time to present the problem. Oh, wow, Dorothy, 10 minutes in a 3-hour class? So let me present this problem. Several of you saw this problem already. This is Manny, and he works with a skip loader in a factory, and he takes boxes back and forth. And on this particular day, let's call it Friday, he was on his break having a nice sandwich, and I would ask the students, what kind of sandwich do you think it is? And is he drinking wine or is he drinking Coke? And, you know, engage them with the picture. He was on his break when his boss came over and said to him, Manny, I need you to do some work for me. I need you to open some boxes. I think we had a bad delivery, and I want to make sure that the boxes have the correct items that we need. And then the boss walked away. So Manny was thinking, oh, shoot, okay. And he goes over to the boxes, and he realizes that he has no way to open the boxes. He's left his utility knife back in his locker because he usually doesn't make use of the utility knife. He's the skip loader. So he looks over on the bench and he sees a co-worker's tools, and in there is a utility knife. And so he opens up the boxes and tells the boss, hey, everything's cool. The boss says, thanks so much. And he continues on, and he says, I sure hope nobody else asks me to do anything on my break. He comes back, and his coworker is shouting and making a lot of noise about the fact that his utility knife has been stolen. His utility knife is gone. Who would steal his utility knife? Now, as you may or may not notice, Manny seems to have the utility knife in his pocket. Manny knows exactly where it is. He knows exactly what happened, but he doesn't want to get in trouble. What should he do? I can also present the problem, obviously, in writing for the students. I think this is a terrific version of this problem, and it's Heidi Spruck-Wrigley, and again, you do have it to download, and she does something called ESL by Design, and she provides all of her materials for free, and she has some wonderful problem solving. And for those of you that got a chance to look at it ahead of time, you already knew this problem, but now you got a chance to hear me provide it. I know that was so special for you. So the very first thing I'm going to ask the students is to think about Manny's situation. What's the problem? And by asking them what is the problem, I mean, there are going to be lots of different problems that the students come up with. Yes, Anna, I understand, and it's, Anna's saying that she finds it hard to find photos or pictures to explain the problem, but you'll have you'll have more opportunities to do that now when you see the bibliography and the handout, where there are lots of that. Lots of that. That's not what I said. There are lots of materials. Okay, it's gotten a little later over here. We're not going to think about that. So, for example, and I'm doing this with you because I want to help you get to the place where you can do this with your own problem that we'll do as in groups. But students might say, the problem is that the coworker is angry. And someone else might say, the problem is Manny borrowed the knife without asking. And someone else might say, the problem is the boss asked Manny to work on a job that's not his job. And Pat said that Manny's problem is that he has the coworker's utility knife. So we can get a lot of different possible problems. And the important thing here is this is divergent thinking. You want to take all the possible problems, and then you want to look at the list of problems with the students and have them decide what is the biggest problem. What's the problem that will really solve all the other problems if we solve that problem? Because if the problem is that the boss asked Manny to do a job that was not his job, well, what's the solution to that? The solution to that is for Manny to talk to the boss. That doesn't resolve the issue that he has right now, which is that the coworker does not have the knife and Manny does. Manny knows where the knife is and the coworker doesn't. So then I would say, okay, we've got all these problems. We pick this problem. Let's pick Pat's problem, which is that Manny's problem is that he has his coworker's utility knife. And let's add in there, and he doesn't know what to do. Because the coworker is angry that he doesn't know where it is. So then I say, well, let's brainstorm solutions. And Lolita comes up with one. He could give him back the knife and explain. Absolutely, that's a solution. And what would be the consequence of that? Can somebody write the consequence of him giving the knife back and explaining the situation? And we have multiple people writing. That's right. So if Manny is afraid of the coworker being angry with him and doesn't know how to deal with that, then it's not a solution for Manny just to explain, because the anger doesn't go away. Yes, we can hope the coworker would say okay. So this is part of the process. So the students are thinking about the consequences of the various solutions. Let's see, if the coworker is understanding, it should be okay once Manny explains what happens. If not, there could be further trouble for Manny. Exactly. Because what if the coworker goes to the boss and says, Manny stole my knife? And the boss doesn't want to say, well, he did that because I asked him to. Well, the boss says, I didn't ask him to take your knife. Manny, you should know better than. I mean, how many situations have we all been in where someone has thrown us under the bus? Let's not think about that. It's Friday. Let's think about happy thoughts. So once you have the solutions, then you're going to analyze. See, there's that great higher level thinking word. You're going to analyze and rate the solutions and think about which solution is best and why. Now, Melissa's saying, first Manny should immediately say, I'm sorry, I borrowed your knife and should have asked you first. I'm so sorry. Please let me explain why I borrowed it. And that's certainly an answer, a solution. It's also possible that there is a loss of face issue there, and that cross-culturally it might be very foreign, a very foreign concept for those two men to engage in that conversation. Not that that's a bad thing. Good feedback, Lolita. Then this is the part that I think you'll find kind of interesting, because it all makes perfect ESL language learning sense up to this point, right? This is not all that different from a reading and asking comprehension questions and maybe expanding on the comprehension questions. But now you have a solution, or two or three. And Group A has come up with this solution, and Group B has come up with another solution, and Group C has come up with another solution. And now they have to apply it. So we have to say what we're going to tell Manny to do and the reasons why, so that he'll have an understanding of what he should do. And there are several ways to do that. The learners could create a role play where the coworker says, oh no, my knife's gone, somebody took it, and now we're doing Melissa's response, Melissa's solution, and Manny walks up to the coworker and says, I need to tell you something, okay? And it's very pragmatic. Melissa's getting lots of good feedback, for those of you that didn't notice, that for her apology-oriented solution. Here's another possibility. These days, text messages are we wouldn't write Manny a letter in this situation. It wouldn't be authentic. But a coworker who knows the story could text. And so the students could write a text message that they would say to Manny. And so this is what Group B came up with. Group B came up with, Manny, put the knife under a table. Find your coworker and ask, is that your knife? LOL. So that's another possibility that the students might come up with. Let's say this is a very belligerent coworker. Let's say that Manny, as a non-native speaker, doesn't have a relationship and doesn't really want to get into it. Let's just say this is an option that the students might come up with. Or the students might come up with making a poster, ways to get along at work. So this is a more general approach where, you should greet your coworkers, you should get to know your coworkers' names. He doesn't know this coworker, and you should always ask before you borrow a coworker's tools. And I just want to point out that we are all on a Friday afternoon. We're listening to the story about Manny, and the chat pod is going wild with people proposing solutions. So if this has a motivating and, what's the word I want to use? It's gone, but it's engaging. If this is engaging you on a Friday afternoon, you can imagine that it would also engage your learners. We're all adults. And we're storytellers in many cases. And so we have advice to give and advice to share. Now, this one is fun if the learners want to take it again from a broader perspective. Rather than role play the actual situation, they role play Jay Leno or Oprah having, discussing the situation and proposing different solutions. And so this is, another possibility. And I just want to make sure that, do Mary and Diana, do you guys have a question? And if you do, you want to type it in the chat pod. Okay. So the key stages that I just showed you of problem solving are: first, consider the situation. Next, state the problem. Next, analyze the problem. And by analyzing, that's meaning you're asking the students to identify the main problem here. So when you have Manny apologizing to the coworker, the main problem is calming the coworker down. You've identified that Manny's afraid because the coworker is angry. So of course, apologizing is correct. But the reason that you're choosing for Manny to apologize first is because you're identifying that the problem is Manny is afraid because of the anger, and apologizing is a way to diffuse the anger. Oh, okay. Okay. And then, so Mary and Diana, do you want me to slow down? Is that perhaps what that raised hand meant? Or was it just a click? I'm waiting for an answer, but I'll go on and then I'll look for your answer after that. The other answer we had was that Manny could explain what happened to his boss and have the boss go and speak to the coworker and return the knife. And that would be that Manny is worried about, doesn't have the language to explain, or doesn't think that the coworker will understand him, and so he needs an intermediary. Or actually Manny believes it's the boss's fault because he was asked during his break, and so he doesn't feel it's his fault that he took the knife, and it's the boss's fault, and so the boss has to make it better. So again, it really matters what you feel the problem is will control what the solution is, and the students will point that out to you. So you then pose solutions. We analyze the problem, then we pose solutions. Remember, all this is in the handout, step by step, with more explanation. And then they analyze and rate the solutions. So in posing the solutions, divergent thinking, synthesis, really high-level thinking skills, very simple language skills, potentially. I mean, of course, the higher the level of the language, the more sophisticated the solutions can sound, but you can propose the same solution in simpler language. Then apply the solution in various ways, write something as an advice to the person who has the problem, role play the situation with the problem and solution in it, role play an expert interview, make a poster, illustrate, retell the story with the solution added, and then evaluate the solution's success and possibly start the whole process again. And Julie's asking a very good question, which is who decides what the main problem is? That has a lot to do with how you set up the problem-solving activity. If you set it up so that each group decides on the solution, decides on the problem, then the group comes to consensus on what the problem is that they think they need to solve. If you decide that you're going to do the whole class approach with the problem so that everyone understands the scenario and everyone understands the problem, then it's a matter of building consensus with the whole class. And you can do that with answer cards so that your lowest level learners can vote on which problem they want. You can have the groups come to a decision and then cast their vote as a group. But Julie, your point is well taken, that you have to decide how you're going to proceed from the identification of the problem on, because that controls everything else. So with a multi-level adaptation, and this is another way to handle it, you can provide the lower level learners in the class with a list of possible solutions and an other. So here are 4 possible solutions. And usually you try to throw in one that really isn't such a great solution for a variety of reasons so that the students can, get rid of. That's a distractor in a way. It's not even a distractor. It's just the one that they get to throw out. So keeping the knife at home would be the one that you would hope most students would say isn't probably the best solution. But you can see that I second-guessed you. Okay, so I put that they give the knife back give the knife to the boss, and also to tell the coworker the story. And then, of course, my texting, my famous sneaky one. The other possibility for multi-level is just as we had the pictures, to provide a single picture, not a sequence of pictures, but a single picture that shows the problem, and to have the students follow the story within the picture. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. For your higher levels, what you might want to do while the lower levels are cementing their understanding is you might want to break them up into likability groups and have them retell the story to each other so that they're really making sure they have the problem. So you do the whole class presentation and then you break it down. So you go work with the lower level learners and make sure that they understand. But while you're doing that, your higher level learners are either retelling the story or writing the story. that they just heard so that they have something to work with. And also by writing the story or retelling the story, you're making it possible for them to go work in mixed level groups later and be able to relate the story to the lower level learners. I'm just watching to see how we're doing. Okay. So now we're at this place where you get to do it. And what I'm going to do is put Mary and Diana, Amy, Anna, Dorothy, and Elizabeth. I'm going to put you all in question 1, okay? Just so you remember, you're going to be in pod 1, and then Julie, Lolita, Melissa, Natasha, Pamela, and Pat, and Vanessa, you're going to be in question 2. And what you're going to do is you're looking at this situation. I'll tell you the story really quickly. This is Mario. He works, there's Mario and there's Julio, okay? That's probably a poor choice. And Mario works for Julio, so that's Mario's boss. And Mario's coworker, Anita. Mario was in a wedding. The boss came, the coworker came. The boss has been drinking. He's about to leave. You can tell by the keys in his hand. And he's going to give Mario's coworker, Anita, a ride home. And Mario does not know what to do. So the first thing I would like you to do is that first group in quest for question 1, I'd like you to answer what vocabulary, content, or grammar forms do you think you'd need to pre-teach this problem? And for question 2, people, would you think of 1 or 2 questions that you would ask to help learners focus on the problem in this picture? So let's just do that for about 3 or 4 minutes. I'll just have you go mad typing. And if you have any, let me put up the chat pod. So if you have any additional questions, I'm going to go ahead and cover up our attendee pod so that if you have anything you want to ask me personally in the process, I can see it in the chat pod. I wonder, Catherine, if now would be an okay time to put up music. Do you think that would be okay since we're going to work for about 3 minutes? And if you could be a little more specific, Elizabeth, about which items in the picture, because not every item probably would have to be pre-taught. If you don't mind bringing it in, Catherine, that would be great, because I took that off my radar. And we just have to make sure we put it so that it's not over the picture. Yeah. And if you happen to find the music too loud, just turn down the volume on your computer. But this gives you a little time. So we're going to work until 6:05 on this task. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I should change. Let me do that right now. I'll change my date and time. Hannah, that's a really good point, but just imagine your class and telling that story. So let's say you're doing, the general theme is transportation and safety issues, and maybe a little bit of civics thrown in. So as you're telling the story, what grammatical forms would they need to be familiar with in order for them to be able to understand the problem? Great point, Pamela. Okay, everybody, I let you go an extra minute. Sorry. Catherine, is it possible to kill the music momentarily? We'll put it back on in a second. Thank you. The good news is that even though you worked on question 1, you will get all of the information that was in question 2 and vice versa, because we all have access now to a wonderful community of practice that's electronically based and is part of, CalPro's wonderful professional development empire. I'll call it that, an empire. And so if you are interested in seeing what everyone wrote in question 1 or question 2, we will post those files, and that will be something you'll be able to get a hold of. You'll also be able to get a hold of other information as well. Oh, okay. Natasha, the person who drank is Mario's boss, and he's had too much to drink. You can see he's got a wine glass, and he's also having a little whiskey at the moment, and so Mario is concerned that the boss has had too much to drink. So that's the story there. Let's take a quick look at, you can scroll up and down. Let's just look up at the very top. So Amy's saying alcohol, drinking, driving safety, questions such as what are the people doing, where are they, wine glass, car keys. There are certain things that are very, very critical for the students to understand, and other things not so much. Tie, bow tie, corsage, not so much. You might use them to help the student understand that Mario had a role in the wedding, but what's much more important is to understand the concept of the setting, which is what Elizabeth points out. And then if you go to question 2, think of 1 or 2 questions you could ask to focus the learner's attention on the topic of the scenario. Let's take a look at Pamela's question. Is it safe for Mario's boss to drive after having had 10 drinks or 2 drinks or 3 drinks? Is it a good idea for Julio to be driving? Why or why not? Now, what you have done is you've asked questions about the scenario, but the question that I asked was for you to think of questions that were helping the learners focus on the topic. So you've actually started asking questions about the problem, but if you remember when we talked about the stages, when you have to prepare students to deal with the vocabulary and any grammar, but you also have to prepare them to deal with the content. So actually the type of question, I want to see if anybody did this. It looks like everybody went with the problem. Oh, maybe Lolita's problem, maybe Lolita's question. So you put up a picture of a bottle of wine, and you put up a picture of car keys, and you say, do these two go together? So that's what I mean by think of 1 or 2 questions you could ask to focus the learner's attention on the topic of the scenario, not the problem itself. Because the problem itself will be, you'll check comprehension and you will ask questions like you've put into this pod, but you really need to be thinking about what kinds of schema building questions can you ask the students to help this problem be more relatable and more authentic for them. Now, I just did this problem-solving workshop, not this exact one clearly, but a problem-solving workshop in Oklahoma, and we had two teachers from Venezuela, and their response was, there's no problem with this. In our country, this would be absolutely okay. No one would question it. So we have cross-cultural issues here. Not just cross-cultural issues, but legal issues that learners would be facing. So it's really a very important situation, and we can't assume because something is verboten in the United States, it's, you know, the same rules apply. So that's why we need to do some work with schema building. Now, we only have a few more minutes to go, and I want to make sure that we bring, you know, this to a lovely close. So let me just tell you that what you would do with number 3 and question number 4 is this would be the type of thing you would be asking yourselves, is to imagine the solutions that your students would come up with. And this is how, Anna, this is something that would also help you to predict the grammar. So if you know the types of solutions students might come up with, then you know that you're going to have to work with certain grammar points. Also, modals are a big part of problem solving. He should, he might, he could. These are things that you know would automatically come up in the language authentically, so it makes sense to at least provide students maybe with a spectrum of advice. So, you know, he must, he has to, he should, he could. So letting students know, see that a little bit is always a really good plan. And boy, we can't go over that stuff enough with our students. So if we cycle that through a few problem solvings, not a problem. And then again, you also want to think about what task are you going to give them at the end of the problem solving where they can demonstrate their outcomes, because really this isn't about us and how we're teaching. I mean, you know, so Catherine and I have talked about this a few times. The workshops tend to be about teaching us as teachers how to do the technique. But what we really need to be focusing on is what are the outcomes for the students? And the outcomes here are that they have learned the language to demonstrate they have the critical thinking that they have and can solve problems, so that if an employer says to them, are you a problem solver? And they say yes, and the employer says, give me an example of a problem you solved recently, they have the language to talk about it. And this is key. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine, I'm sure you've been in those situations with interviews. So in closing, there are a few things here. There are a few housekeeping things that I'll ask Catherine to deal with, but I would like to be sure that you see down at the bottom on the left-hand side, there is a file share pod, and it says handout, application task, and additional materials. You are welcome in the next several minutes. You're welcome to download those to your computer, and the way that you do that is you click on the file, highlight it, and it will come up with a little tab that says save to my computer, and you go ahead and do that. And if you don't have time before the site closes, Catherine, how much time do we have before I know we will end at 6.
This room,
but
in fact, today, unfortunately, I'm not able to keep it open much longer. But I wanted to reassure everybody that on Monday morning, this recording will be available in our electronic community of practice, and through the recording, not only can you catch any bit you missed, but you can download all these same materials, and the chat pods that Jamie mentioned that we wanted to share, those will be available too. So this afternoon there's not a lot of extra time. We need to wrap up, but we'll be sure to follow up on Monday morning, and you can apply is too great a word. You can sign up for the electronic community practice. It just has 3 simple questions, takes about a minute, and we'd love to get you in. You're all eligible for it. Not yet.
Are any of these items in there yet or not yet? Okay, so that's something that maybe I could do.
Okay. Okay, that sounds great.
Is put them in there so that people could get them from there as well. Yeah, okay. So if you're having any difficulty in downloading them right now, I forgot that it's Friday, and that can be an issue with keeping the room open. So if you haven't been able to download, don't worry, I'll go put them in the electronic community of practice. When Catherine closes the session, the webinar evaluation comes up, and then does
the
it
ECOP contains the webinar evaluation, and when you close this room, we will direct you to that site. It's also listed in the pod on the right. Here, let me make it in a color that will stand out.
Right. Well, everybody, I have to say that you have made it such a pleasure to speak with you from Fairfax, Virginia, and to solve problems together in the afternoon, and great problem solving going on for those of you that were proposing solutions to Manny's issue. And what should happen here now is that you'll get a little message when we close this that will send you over to the ECOP, but if by any chance you don't, you might want to just write down calproecop.groupsite.com, and that will allow you to get right there. And Melissa, thank you. And I really hope that you find this to be very valuable for your learners. But if you do have additional questions, my email is lightheartedlearning@gmail.com. And that's also, I believe, it's on the handout. So feel free to email me. And I wish you lots of solutions, minimal aggravation, and only the kinds of problems that are chewy and fun to solve.
Thanks, everyone, for your participation.